The room smells of medicine and old money, antiseptic layered over cedar and leather, the smell of a man who has spent 82 years being cared for by people paid to do it well. Charles Whitley lies propped against a small mountain of pillows, an oxygen line taped beneath his nose, his silver hair pressed flat on one side, from days spent mostly horizontal. Beside the bed, his attorney stands holding a dark leather folder stamped will, waiting on the signature that will finally end the question of who will inherit the Whitley empire, and confirm, in ink, that no one carrying his blood will ever claim it. Tonight, after decades of refusing, Charles has agreed to sign. Then the bedroom door opens, and a young woman steps inside carrying a small tray of tea. She is temporary catering staff, the kind of employee whose name nobody in the house has bothered to learn, and Charles doesn't look up as she crosses the room. He stopped finding anything in this bedroom worth looking at weeks ago. It isn't until she bends forward to set the cup on his nightstand that something slips loose from beneath the collar of her uniform. A locket, heavy and gold, its edges worn soft by more than half a century of being touched. Charles stops breathing. He reaches for her before he understands why his hand is moving, his fingers trembling against the blanket. "Where did you get that?" he says, and the words come out rougher than he means them to. She thinks at first that he means the tea, and starts to apologize for whatever she's done wrong. "The locket." He points at her chest, with a hand that won't stay still. Confused, she touches it instinctively, the way people touch things they've worn so long they've stopped noticing them. "It belonged to my grandmother," she says. Whatever color remains in Charles's face drains out of it entirely. "What was her name?" Something in the way he asks makes her hesitate, some instinct warning her the answer matters more than it should to a dying stranger. "Evelyn," she says finally. "Evelyn Kizer." The pen slips from Charles's fingers and disappears into the blankets. Neither he nor his attorney moves to find it. The attorney, a man who has served Charles Whitley for 31 years and believed he'd seen every version of him there was to see, watches a stranger's expression settle over his employer's face, grief and disbelief in equal measure, the look of a man confronting a ghost he has spent 58 years convincing himself didn't exist. "That's impossible," Charles whispers. She doesn't know what's impossible. She only knows that he's no longer looking at her. He's looking through her, 58 years into a past she knows nothing about. Fade to black. 24 hours earlier. A folder sits on the nightstand, its gold letters catching the lamplight. Will. Charles Whitley has built an empire large enough to fill that folder with more zeros than most men could imagine. And yet the single page that matters most remains unsigned, the pen resting beside it, untouched. Charles Whitley owns hotels on 4 continents, office towers that shape 3 skylines, private islands he hasn't set foot on in a decade, and enough art to fill museums that will never open to the public. None of it fits inside the room his life has narrowed into. A bed, an oxygen line, a rotation of nurses who speak to him the way people speak to something breakable, unpredictable, his cardiologist says. "That's the word I keep coming back to. Give me a better one. I don't have one." The mansion runs like a hospital, wearing evening clothes. Staff move through marble halls in soft shoes. Medicine sits beside crystal decanters that haven't been touched in years. Somewhere below, a chef prepares meals Charles no longer has the appetite to eat. For a dining room he no longer has the strength to enter. Thomas Greer has been his attorney for 31 years, and he has never once seen Charles cry, get drunk, or raise his voice. He has seen him build and dissolve companies with the same flat calm. He has never seen him afraid, until now. "You need to sign it," Thomas says, setting the folder on the blanket. "I know what I need to do." "Then, do it." You say that like it's simple. It's a signature, Charles. It's the last sentence of a story with no ending. Charles doesn't look at the folder. "I built all of this so it would outlive me. And there's no one left to hand it to. There's Damien." And Charles's mouth tightens. There's Damien. Damien Whitley is 46, athletic, and dress the way men dress when they've decided what kind of man they're going to be seen as. He already runs most of Whitley Holdings in practice, if not on paper, has run it for years, quietly, competently, waiting. He visits twice a week. He brings reports instead of flowers. The Singapore property closed 2 points above projection, he tells Charles, standing at the foot of the bed like a man reporting to a board. I've restructured the Lisbon debt. The company is stable. It's ready. Ready for what? For you to stop worrying about it. Charles studies him the way he studies a contract he doesn't trust. You've wanted this since you were 12. I've worked for this since I was 12. That's not the same thing. Damien doesn't argue. He never argues with Charles. He waits. The way he's waited for everything, certain that time is doing the arguing for him. When he leaves, Charles's eyes go, as they always do, to the nightstand drawer no one is permitted to open. Nurses have learned not to ask. Housekeeping has learned not to dust it. Inside is a single photograph, its corners soft with age, a young man and a young woman standing close together outside a hotel that no longer exists in the form it did in 1968. Charles doesn't take it out tonight. He doesn't need to. He knows exactly what it shows. Who is she? A new nurse asked once, catching him looking. No one, Charles said. Not anymore. He didn't open the drawer for a week after that. 40 minutes across the city, Laura Kizer is doing the math on a stack of bills for the third time, hoping the numbers will be kinder on the third try. They aren't. Funeral costs, hospital costs. The costs no one warns you about, the ones that arrive quietly in the mail for months after the person is already gone. She's 29 years old, sharper than most of the people who've hired her, and stuck working banquet shifts and private catering gigs, because sharp doesn't pay rent, reliable does. 6 months ago, her mother, Grace, died after a long illness, and Laura inherited exactly 3 things of value: a locket, a photograph, and a sealed envelope Grace made her promise never to open unless she needed it. Needed it how? Laura had asked. You'll know, Grace said. You'll know when. The locket is gold, heavier than it looks, worn smooth at the edges from being touched by hands that came before hers. She has priced it twice at pawn shops, walked in with it in her pocket both times, and walked out both times with it still around her neck. Some things are worth more than what anyone will pay you for them, her mother used to say, and Laura never understood it as instruction until she needed the money badly enough to test it. The call comes on a Tuesday, a private catering agency, a name she recognizes from the society pages before she even hears the address. Whitley Estate, the woman on the phone says. One night, it pays triple. Whitley like the hotels? That Whitley. Laura says yes before she finishes the sentence, because triple is triple, and the Whitleys are just a name to her, a name on hotel awnings, a name in headlines about mergers she's never read past the first paragraph. It means nothing personal. It means a good night's pay. The estate is the kind of enormous that makes voices drop without anyone asking them to. A house manager briefs the staff before service. Don't approach the family wing. Don't speak to Mr. Whitley, unless spoken to first. Don't linger. Laura nods along with the rest of them, half listening, more focused on not spilling anything on a rug that probably costs more than her car. Then, 20 minutes before the first course, word moves through the kitchen like a change in air pressure. Mr. Whitley won't be coming down. Mr. Whitley wants his tray sent up. I'll take it, Laura says, mostly because someone has to, and she'd rather be moving than standing still, holding a tray of unclaimed hors d'oeuvres. Fast in, fast out, the house manager tells her. He doesn't like an audience. Laura climbs a staircase wide enough for a wedding party, down a hallway lined with portraits of Whitleys, who all seem to be squinting at something just past the camera. She balances the tray, straightens the crisp collar of a uniform that she knocks once. No answer. She pushes the door open with her shoulder, the way she's been trained to. Tray first. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see how far our story travels with you. He is thinner than the portraits downstairs suggest, propped upright against a mountain of pillows, an oxygen line beneath his nose, his silver hair disordered in a way that says he stopped caring what it looked like months ago. He barely glances at her. "Set it there," he says, nodding toward the table. Laura crosses the room, sets down the tray, and reaches to fix the strap of her apron, and that's when the locket slips loose from beneath her collar and catches the lamplight. What happens next is the same thing that happens at the start of this story, because it is the start of this story. The question that isn't about the tea, the name that stops a room, the pen disappearing into the blankets, while nobody moves to find it. By the time the door closes behind the last nurse, it's only Charles, Thomas, and a woman still holding an empty tray like a shield. "You're scaring me," she says. "I'm sorry," Charles says, and he sounds like he means it, which somehow makes it worse. "Where was she born? Your grandmother?" "I don't know exactly. The South, I think." "Why does that matter? When did she die?" "Years before I was born." "Sir, please. I don't understand what's happening. Was she ever married?" "Not that I know of." "Why are you asking me this?" Charles's hand is still extended, palm up, trembling. "May I see it?" Laura's fingers go to the clasp out of some instinct she doesn't examine too closely, and a moment later, the locket is resting in his palm. He turns it over with the careful, reverent slowness of a man handling something he thought had been lost to him permanently. On the back, worn nearly smooth but still legible if you know to look, 2 letters, entwined. C+E. "I've always wondered what the C stood for," Laura says. "My grandmother never told anyone. I put those letters there," Charles says. "I scratched them in with a pocket knife on a train platform, because I couldn't afford a jeweler, and I couldn't wait. That's not possible. You didn't know her." "I asked her to marry me, Miss Kizer." Laura almost laughs, the sound catching somewhere in her throat instead. "You're confused. You have the wrong family. There's no way you—" And then she remembers the photograph. It's in her bag, has been in her bag every shift since her mother died, because she's never been able to leave it anywhere else. She pulls it out with hands that aren't entirely steady and holds it up next to the bed. A young man, a young woman, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, standing in front of a hotel awning that reads Whitley. Charles looks at his own face, 40 years younger, and makes a sound Thomas has never heard him make in 31 years of knowing him. "Sir," Thomas says carefully, "I think the will can wait." Charles doesn't answer him. He's still staring at the photograph, at the woman beside him, at a version of his own life he buried so deep he told himself it had never existed. "Did she—" he starts, and has to stop. Tries again. "Did Evelyn have children?" He tells her about 1968, because there's no way to answer the question without going back that far. He was 24, she was 22, working the dining room of the original Whitley Hotel, the one his father built before the empire had a name. He noticed her the way you notice weather changing, gradually, and then all at once. They met in stairwells, and after closing, and in the hour before the city woke up, because there was no version of 1968, where a Whitley and a black waitress could be seen together in daylight, without consequences finding them both. "I told her I'd marry her," Charles says. "I meant it. I've never meant anything the way I meant that. What happened?" "My father found out." His voice goes flat, the way it does when a man has practiced not feeling something for 58 years. "He told me I'd lose everything, the company, the family name, all of it, if I didn't end it. I told him I didn't care. But you did care." "I told myself I didn't. We planned to leave together. A train, a date, a platform. I was there." He looks at his hands. She wasn't. "That's not what happened," Laura says, and there's an edge in her voice now, something sharpening. "My grandmother waited at that station. My mother told me the story 100 times growing up. She waited for hours. You never came. I was there. She was there. They stare at each other, both certain, both holding a version of the same night that cancels the other one out. My father showed me documents a week later, Charles says slowly, like he's hearing it out loud for the first time, and not liking how it sounds. Papers claiming she'd taken money from him to disappear. I believed him. I wrote to her anyway. Every letter came back unopened. She never got a single letter from you, Laura says. She waited years, Mr. Whitley. She used to tell my mother that love doesn't just evaporate, it gets taken from people, on purpose, by someone who benefits from it being gone. The silence that follows has weight to it, both of them arriving, separately, at the same unbearable possibility, that neither of them lied. That someone else did. There's something else, Laura says, and hesitates in a way that makes Charles brace for it, before she even says it. She was pregnant when she left. Charles doesn't speak, doesn't move. Thomas, standing by the window, goes very still. My mother, Laura says quietly, was her daughter. The envelope has been sealed since the day Grace died. Kept in the bottom of a box, Laura hasn't fully unpacked since her last move, because some part of her has always known that opening it would change something she wasn't ready to change. She retrieves it 2 days later, sitting on the edge of a guest room bed in a house she still can't quite believe she's allowed to be inside, and breaks the seal with Charles watching from a wheelchair positioned by the window, too weak now to sit up in a regular chair for long. Grace's handwriting is careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who knew she was writing something that mattered. My father came from the Whitley family, it reads. My mother never said his name out loud, not once, not even to me, because she was afraid of what that family could still do to us, even after everything they'd already done. She said the money didn't matter. She said what mattered was that he never came, and she wasn't going to spend her life waiting for a man who chose his name over her. Laura's hands are shaking by the time she finishes. Her birth date, Charles says. His voice comes out rough. What was it? Laura tells him. Charles does the arithmetic silently, and it lands exactly where he was afraid it would. Show me a photograph of her. Of Grace. Laura finds one on her phone, holds it up. Charles studies it for a long time, longer than seems necessary, until Laura realizes he isn't just looking, he's searching, feature by feature, for something he recognizes. Her eyes, he says finally, and his voice breaks on the word. Those are my mother's eyes. He doesn't say anything else for almost a minute. When he does, it's barely above a whisper. If Grace was my daughter, he says, then you are my granddaughter. It's Damien who finds out next, and not gently. He hears it secondhand from a nurse, confirms it from Thomas with a look that could strip paint, and appears in Charles's room within the hour with a folder of his own, bank statements, collection notices, a debt history that reads, in his telling, like a confession. She's drowning in debt, Charles. Do you understand what that means? A woman shows up out of nowhere wearing an antique locket and a sob story. Right when you're about to sign your estate away, you don't find that convenient? I find it a lot of things. Convenient isn't one of them. She needs money. You have money. That's not a mystery. That's a motive. Get out, Damien. I'm trying to protect you. You're trying to protect your inheritance. Don't confuse the two in front of me again. Laura, who has heard most of this from the hallway, is already reaching for her coat when Charles calls her back in. Don't leave. Maybe he's right to ask, she says. Maybe I shouldn't be here at all. Maybe, Charles says, but I'd like to know for certain, one way or another, before you decide that for both of us. How? A DNA test. Properly done. If I'm wrong about this, about you, I need to know that too. Laura looks at him for a long moment, at the oxygen line, the trembling hands, the eyes that have not stopped looking at her, like she's something he thought he'd never see again. All right, she says. Charles nods, and for the first time since she walked through his door, carrying a tray she never wanted to carry, something in his face looks less like grief and more like hope, which frightens her more than the grief did. "If you're my granddaughter," he says quietly, "I have 58 years of apologies to make. I'd like the chance to start." The days while they wait for the results are the strangest of Charles's life, because for the first time in decades, he isn't waiting for a deal to close or a market to move. He's waiting to find out if he's already met his own family and simply didn't recognize her. He asks about Grace, the way a man asks about a country he was told he'd never be allowed to visit. "What was she like as a child?" "I don't know," Laura says. "I wasn't there for that part." "Right, of course." He looks embarrassed by his own question, which surprises her. She hasn't seen him embarrassed before, only imperious or afraid. "What was she like as your mother then?" "That," she can answer. "Stubborn. Funny when she wanted to be, which wasn't often enough. She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, and never once let me see her tired." Laura pauses. She wore that same expression you get sometimes, like she was doing arithmetic behind her eyes. "What kind of arithmetic?" "The kind where you're always calculating what you can afford to feel." Charles absorbs that in silence. He asks about her wedding. There'd been one. Brief. Ended before Laura turned 5. And about the illness at the end. And whether Grace had been afraid. And whether she'd said anything about him. Ever. In 58 years of not knowing his face. "She wasn't afraid of dying," Laura says. "She was afraid of leaving me with nothing figured out. The last month, she kept apologizing for the debt, like it was a character flaw, instead of a hospital bill. I could have paid for all of it 100 times over without noticing the money was gone. You didn't know she existed." "I know. I'm not saying it to feel guilty out loud. I'm saying it because it's the kind of thing that keeps a man up at night, once he does know." He looks down at his own hands, thin now, spotted with age in a way they weren't in the photograph in the drawer. "There's an entire life I could have made easier, and I spent it building hotels instead." "You didn't know," Laura says again, more gently this time, because something in his face has stopped looking like a billionaire cataloging regrets and started looking like an old man grieving a daughter he never got to meet. That's supposed to make it better. It doesn't, particularly. Thomas, present for most of these conversations, the way a good attorney learns to be present without being noticed, watches Charles soften in ways he hasn't seen in 31 years of knowing him, and can't decide whether it's the best thing that's happened to his oldest client or the most dangerous. "She used to say her father was a mistake her mother never regretted," Laura says. "I always thought that meant he'd been unkind." "It meant I was absent," Charles says quietly, which, for what it's worth, feels worse. He starts doing something he hasn't allowed himself in years, imagining. A version of his life where he'd shown up at that station and someone had actually been standing there. A birthday he might have attended, a wedding he might have walked her down the aisle for. 58 years condense into a single ledger of things he didn't get to do, and for a man who has spent his whole life adding, it's the first subtraction that's ever actually hurt. Damien watches this unfold with the calm of someone counting down a clock only he can see. "You're planning your future around a woman we know nothing about," he tells Charles one evening, standing at the foot of the bed the way he always stands, like he's inspecting a property. "Grief makes people careless. I understand the appeal of this story. I don't understand why you're willing to bet the company on it." "I'm not betting the company. You're rewriting your will in your head. I can see it happening. Then you're paying closer attention to my face than to your job." "I'm paying attention to both," Damien says. Someone has to. The result arrives on a gray Thursday morning, in a plain envelope that looks far too ordinary for what it's about to do to the room. Thomas opens it, with the same careful hands he uses for everything, and reads it twice before he says anything at all, which is how Charles knows before a word is spoken. "No biological relationship detected," Thomas says finally, and the sentence lands like something dropped from a great height. Nobody moves. Laura's face doesn't change right away. It's like watching a building stand for one extra second after the foundation gives out, before gravity remembers its job. That's not possible, she says. The lab is reputable, Thomas says gently. I don't have a reason to doubt the result. Damien doesn't bother hiding his relief. I didn't want to be right about this. You look like a man who wanted to be right about this, Laura says. I look like a man who watched his uncle nearly hand a fortune to a stranger, with a sympathetic story and a piece of jewelry. Enough, Charles says, but it comes out weaker than he means it to, and Laura notices. She notices everything about his face now, has learned to read it the way you learn a language out of necessity, and what she sees isn't defense. It's doubt. Small, involuntary, there and gone in half a second, but she's spent her whole life reading the exact moment someone decides not to believe her, and she knows it when she sees it. You think I made this up, she says. I don't think that. You don't not think it. I can see it on you. Laura, I came here to serve your dinner, she says, and her voice is very steady, which is somehow worse than if it had broken. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be told I might be your granddaughter, and I certainly didn't ask to be told I'm a liar for believing it when you're the one who noticed the locket first. I never called you a liar. You didn't have to. She's already reaching for her coat, for the photograph on the nightstand, for the locket she takes off in one motion and doesn't put back on, carries instead, closed in her fist, like something too heavy to wear anymore. I hope the will works out the way you both want it to. Laura, wait. But she's already at the door, and Charles, weak and slow, and suddenly furious at his own body for being too weak and slow to stop her, watches her go the way he watched Evelyn go, 58 years earlier, from a distance, too late, telling himself afterward that he'd done everything he could when some quiet, honest part of him knows he hadn't. The door closes. Damien exhales, satisfied. Charles doesn't say anything for a long time. Get out, he finally says, to Damien, in a voice with nothing left in it. The curtains stay closed for 4 days. Charles doesn't ask for the television, doesn't take calls, barely eats. Thomas has seen him withdraw before, after his father's death, after a hostile takeover attempt that nearly ended the company in the 90s, but never like this, never with the specific, hollowed-out quality of a man who let a second chance walk out a door and didn't chase it. Thomas occupies himself the only way he knows how, which is with paperwork. He requests the DNA documentation from the laboratory, a formality, something to do with his hands, and finds himself frowning at it almost immediately. It isn't the lab Charles's physicians usually use. It's a private collection service, one Thomas doesn't recognize, contracted directly rather than through the hospital's standard intake. He checks the invoice. The account that arranged it isn't billed to the estate. It's billed to a subsidiary of Whitley Holdings that Damien oversees personally. That's unusual, Thomas says to no one, and writes himself a note. Across the city, Laura is doing her own kind of grieving, which for her has always looked like cleaning. She sits at her kitchen table with a soft cloth and the old photograph, wiping decades of dust from a frame she's never once taken apart, and it's only because her hands are shaking with something between grief and anger that she presses harder than she means to, and the backing of the frame, brittle with age, cracks loose at one corner. She almost doesn't investigate. She almost just sets it aside, but something makes her peel the backing the rest of the way off, and folded flat against the inside of the frame, hidden for God knows how many years, is a small square of paper, yellowed and thin, in handwriting she recognizes instantly, because it's the same hand that wrote the sealed envelope. St. Augustine's, Millbrook Road, it reads. Grace's birth date, April 3rd, 1969, Registry 1118-C. If Charles ever comes looking, Laura reads it 4 times before she trusts herself to stand up. She doesn't call Charles. She isn't ready to hear his voice yet, not after the look on his face, not after the doubt she saw settle there for half a second and never fully leave. She calls Thomas instead. I need you to look at something with me, she says. Not him. You. They meet at the church the following afternoon, a modest brick building that has somehow survived 60 years of a changing city. The current pastor, elderly himself, remembers enough about the archive to point them toward a locked room in the basement, where records going back a century are kept in labeled boxes nobody has opened in longer than Laura has been alive. The baptismal record is there, exactly where the note said it would be. Grace Elaine. The entry reads, Mother, Evelyn Kizer. The line for the father carries only 2 initials, CW. The rest left deliberately incomplete, the kind of half-answer left by someone protecting a child, rather than someone who simply didn't know. But tucked into the same box, in an envelope marked supplementary, private, is a second document, a notarized statement Evelyn filed years later, when Grace was already grown, naming the father in full, for a record she apparently never intended to be public, but couldn't bring herself to leave entirely unwritten. Charles Edward Whitley. The pastor leaves them alone with the boxes, and for a while neither of them speaks. Thomas photographs each page carefully, methodically, the way he's photographed 1,000 contracts, though his hands aren't quite as steady as they usually are for contracts. This wasn't hidden by accident, he says eventually. Someone filed a public record and a private one, deliberately, in 2 different places. That's not the behavior of a woman hiding a lie. That's the behavior of a woman building a case she hoped she'd never have to use. You think she knew Charles would come looking someday? I think she hoped he might, and prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't, and made sure that either way, the truth would survive her. Thomas closes the box gently, like closing something that deserves more respect than a filing cabinet usually gets. That's not the profile of someone who wanted money, Miss Kizer. Money doesn't need a paper trail 60 years long. Vindication does. Laura sits on the basement floor with the document in her lap for a long time. She could have used this, she says finally. To Thomas, to herself. She could have taken it to a lawyer, taken it to the papers, gone after everything the Whitleys had. She had proof. And instead she hid it in a picture frame and never said a word. Why do you think that is? Because she wasn't after his money. Laura's voice catches. She was after the truth outliving her, in case anyone ever needed it. She wasn't trying to take anything from him. She was trying to make sure that someday, someone could prove she'd never lied. She looks up at Thomas. She spent her whole life protecting evidence instead of spending it, and I almost sold her locket. Thomas doesn't tell Charles what they've found yet. Instead, he does what he does best, which is disappear into paperwork until the paperwork tells him something worth reporting. He requests access to the Whitley family archive, decades of correspondence, most of it never digitized, stored in a climate-controlled room that hasn't been properly cataloged since Charles's father's era. It takes him 3 days to find the letters, and when he does, his hands aren't entirely steady either. Dozens of them. Evelyn's handwriting, addressed to Charles, care of the Whitley Hotel corporate office, a return address she must have been told to use, must have believed would reach him. None of them were forwarded. Charles's own letters, drafted and mailed to an address in another city, are there too, returned and unopened, intercepted before they ever left the building. A ledger, kept by Charles's father's personal secretary, tracks payments to a private investigator and to a hotel manager for their discretion regarding Miss Kizer's departure. It is, in its own quiet bureaucratic way, a full confession. What Thomas finds next is worse, because it isn't 58 years old. It's recent. The archive's digital access log, installed only a decade ago, when the family finally modernized its records, shows a login under Damien's credentials, accessing this exact folder, 7 years earlier. Long before Laura ever walked through a bedroom door with a tray of tea. Thomas cross-references the date against Damien's calendar from that year, the way he cross-references everything, out of habit more than suspicion at first. 7 years ago, the same week as the login, Damien had commissioned a private genealogical review of family liability exposure, his own phrase, buried in an invoice Thomas has to read twice to understand. Not a search for a lost relative, a search for a lost relative's ability to make a claim. Thomas sits with that for a long moment before he brings it to Charles. Charles listens to all of it without moving, without interrupting, and when Thomas finishes, he asks only one question. 7 years. 7 years, Thomas confirms. He knew there might be a descendant. He knew, and he said nothing, because a descendant is the one thing standing between him and everything he's spent his life expecting to inherit. And the first test. I've requested the chain of custody records from the lab Damien arranged. There are gaps. A sample handled outside protocol, a technician who no longer works there, paperwork that doesn't match standard procedure. Thomas removes his glasses, cleans them. A habit Charles has learned means he's choosing his next words carefully. I can't prove fraud yet. But I can prove it was compromised enough that no honest lab would stand behind that result today. Charles closes his eyes. Get her back. She may not come. Then ask her to let us try again. Properly. Independent hospital. Independent staff. You as witness. No one from this family, within 100 feet of the sample. He opens his eyes. I owe her that much. Before I owe her anything else. Laura says yes. But only after making Thomas repeat every safeguard twice. And only after making it clear the terms are non-negotiable. If Damien's name touches this test in any way, I walk, and I don't come back a third time. Understood, Thomas says. The second collection happens in a hospital wing, with no Whitley affiliation at all, under fluorescent light, with a technician who has never heard of any of them. It feels, Laura thinks, almost anticlimactic. A swab, a label, a signature, for something that's already cost this much. Damien, meanwhile, is no longer waiting on anyone's schedule but his own. He understands, with the particular clarity of a man who has always been good at reading rooms, that the walls are closing in faster than he can rebuild them. If the second test confirms what the first was built to deny, he doesn't just lose an inheritance, he loses the company outright, and possibly his freedom, depending on how thoroughly Thomas decides to pursue the fraud. So he does what he's always done when a deal turns against him. He moves before the other side finishes moving. Quietly, without telling Charles, he retains a second set of attorneys and begins drafting a petition, a request to have Charles evaluated for competency on the grounds that a dying, grieving, elderly man has become dangerously susceptible to manipulation by a stranger claiming a blood tie no legitimate test has yet confirmed. The stress of the following days doesn't help Charles's heart. 3 nights before the second results are due, he collapses in the hallway outside his own bedroom, and the house that has felt like a hospital for months finally becomes one in earnest. Sirens, a real one this time, a team of paramedics moving through rooms that were built for galas, not gurneys. He survives it. But when he's brought back to the estate, 2 days later, gray and diminished, in a way that frightens even Thomas, the results still haven't arrived, and everyone in the house understands, without saying it, that they are now racing something, with no interest in fairness. Charles is barely upright when Damien arrives with his attorneys, moving with the brisk, apologetic efficiency of a man who has convinced himself he's doing something difficult but necessary. I wouldn't do this if there were another way, Damien says, which is the first lie of several. He lays documents across the blanket, the same way Thomas once laid the will. Temporary conservatorship. It protects you, and it protects the company, until we know for certain what's real and what isn't. I know what's real, Charles says, and his voice is a fraction of what it used to be. You believed a woman who failed a DNA test was your granddaughter. I'm not sure you do. That test was compromised, and you know it, because you're the one who compromised it. Damien's expression doesn't so much as flicker. That's a serious accusation for a man who can barely hold a pen. Then hold it for me, Charles says, and watch me not sign what you brought. Thomas, standing near the door, is already stalling, flipping through the conservatorship documents with exaggerated care, raising questions about jurisdiction, about witnesses, about notarization, anything to buy minutes he isn't sure he has. It's Laura who ends the stalling, arriving fast enough that she's still catching her breath, the photograph in one hand, and the locket, worn again around her neck, catching the light the same way it did the first night. "The results are in," she says. Thomas takes the envelope from her, and this time his hands are steady, because this time he already suspects what it says. "Probability of a biological grandparent relationship," he reads aloud, "greater than 99.9%. The room goes silent, in a completely different way than it did the first time. Charles makes a sound that isn't quite a word, and his eyes fill before he can stop them, an old man crying without any of the composure he's spent 82 years perfecting. "That's not conclusive," Damien says, too quickly. "One test contradicts another. That happens. Labs make mistakes." "The first lab didn't make a mistake," Thomas says. "It was compromised. I have the chain of custody gaps, the unauthorized handling, the billing records tracing the collection service directly to a subsidiary you control. I also have login records showing you accessed correspondence about Evelyn Kizer 7 years ago. Correspondence proving you knew a Whitley descendant might exist long before any of us did." Damien's carefully maintained calm cracks for the first time since any of this began. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly what's at stake," Charles says. "My family, which you tried to erase twice, once when you found out, and once when you thought I'd finally found out too." Laura steps forward and sets a folded letter on the blanket beside him. The last one, Evelyn's final letter, recovered from the same archive Thomas has spent weeks excavating. Charles's hands shake too badly to hold it steady, so Laura reads it aloud instead, her voice unsteady in places she doesn't try to hide. "I waited at that station until the last train left," the letter says, in Evelyn's careful hand. "I told myself he'd come on the next one. I told myself that for longer than I should have. I never stopped loving him, even after I stopped believing he'd chosen me. I hope, if anyone ever reads this, that they understand I didn't leave out of anger. I left because I thought I'd already been left." Charles closes his eyes. 58 years condense into a single sentence. Two people who loved each other for an entire lifetime, while each one believed, with total certainty, that the other had walked away first. "She never stopped," Charles says, mostly to himself. Damien tries once more, quieter now, almost pleading. "She's still a stranger, Charles. However this happened, however sympathetic the story is, she doesn't know you. She knows what you're worth." Charles looks at Laura for a long moment. "When you first walked into this room," he asks, "did you know who I was to you?" "No," Laura says. "Did you come here looking for money?" "I came here to serve your dinner." It's the same answer she gave him weeks ago, word for word, and this time, it lands the way it was always meant to. Charles reaches for the conservatorship documents, with hands that barely cooperate, and tears them, slowly, with an effort that costs him more than it should, but he finishes it. "You're removed from Whitley Holdings," he tells Damien. "Effective now. Thomas will handle the details, all of them, including whatever the fraud requires." "I built half of what this company is today," Damien says, and for the first time, there's real panic under the composure, the sound of a man watching the only future he ever planned for come apart in real time. "I gave up 20 years for this. I turned down offers from 3 other firms because I believed I was owed the thing I'd earned." "You were never owed anything," Charles says. "You were positioned to inherit something, which isn't the same, and you knew the difference the day you decided hiding a child was safer than risking your position." "That's not ambition, Damien. That's theft with better tailoring. You're choosing her over 30 years of family. I'm choosing the truth over 30 years of being lied to," Charles says. There's a difference, and you've never once understood it. He turns to Laura, and for the first time since she walked through his door, his voice carries no fear in it at all. This is my granddaughter. The weeks that follow are not dramatic in the way the previous months have been. There are no more tests, no more folders marked will, laid across blankets like verdicts. Instead, there are lawyers of a different, quieter kind, the ones who build trusts instead of contesting them, and Charles spends what strength he has left, making sure the fortune he built doesn't simply change hands, but changes purpose. Laura becomes his principal heir, but not in the way Damien once imagined inheritance working. A trust protects the company from being liquidated for anyone's convenience. Provisions are written in for the housekeepers, the drivers, the kitchen staff who have worked the estate for decades and would otherwise have been forgotten in the transition. Damien receives nothing but the legal consequences of what he arranged, which Thomas pursues without mercy and without apology. Charles insists on one more thing before the story becomes official. He tells it publicly, not through a press release written by someone else, but in his own words, delivered from the same bed he spent months confined to, recorded and released without editing. He tells them about Evelyn, about his father, about letters intercepted, and a young woman driven out of town for the crime of being loved by the wrong family's son. His advisors warn him it will damage the Whitley name, that some legacies are better left curated than confessed. A name protected by a lie, Charles says, isn't worth protecting. Laura starts visiting without the uniform now, though some part of her still instinctively reaches for an apron that isn't there. She brings photographs. Grace as a child, Grace at a graduation Charles never got to attend, Grace laughing at something on a beach he'll never know the name of, and Charles studies each one, like a man being handed back pieces of a life he thought he'd have to live without. "Tell me about the wedding," he says. "It didn't last." "Tell me anyway." She does. She tells him about birthdays and report cards, and the year Grace lost her job, and never told anyone how close they'd come to losing the apartment. She isn't gentle with the details, and Charles doesn't ask her to be. He listens to all of it, the good and the difficult, the way a man listens when he's trying to make up for not being there the first time. They visit Evelyn's grave together on a quiet afternoon in early autumn. Charles in a wheelchair, Laura pushes herself, refusing the offer of an aid. The headstone is modest, the kind bought by a family with very little money and a great deal of pride. Charles sits in front of it for a long time before he speaks. "I'm sorry," he says, to the stone, to the ground, to 58 years he can't get back. "I should have come looking. I told myself I had no reason to believe you'd want to be found. And that was a coward's excuse, and I knew it even then." Laura doesn't tell him it's all right, because it isn't. Not entirely. Not yet. She kept every piece of proof she ever had, she says instead. She wasn't waiting for money. She was waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. "I'm asking them now." "I know. It still took 58 years. "It did," Charles agrees. "I'm not asking you to pretend that doesn't matter. I'm only asking for whatever time is left." Laura doesn't forgive him completely that day, and she tells him so, honestly, the way her mother raised her to be honest, even when it costs something. But she comes back the following week, and the week after that, and slowly, believably slowly, the way trust actually rebuilds instead of the way it does in stories that rush it, something between them starts to resemble family. Some visits are ordinary, in a way neither of them expected to find comforting. She teaches him to play a card game Grace used to play with her as a child, and he's terrible at it, and she doesn't let him win. He teaches her, in turn, to identify which of the estate's paintings are worth actually looking at, and which were bought purely to impress people who never came back to look at them twice, and she finds she likes the honesty of that more than she expected to. Neither of them mentions the will. It stops feeling like the point. "I keep waiting to feel like your granddaughter," she admits to him one evening, months in, when the word still catches slightly on its way out of her mouth. Instead, I mostly just feel like someone who knows you now. That's not a lesser thing, Charles says. That's the thing I actually wanted. The paperwork was never going to give me that. Only time was. Charles's last major act is the one that will outlast everyone in the room, the day he signs it. The Evelyn Kizer Foundation, funded from the estate itself, built to do for others what money alone was never able to do for Evelyn. Hospitality scholarships for students who'd otherwise never see the inside of the schools that train the industry Charles built his fortune on, vocational training, housing assistance for workers one bad month away from losing everything, grants named quietly, without fanfare, after a woman who spent her life being erased and now can't be. Charles dies on a morning in late winter, in the same bedroom where all of this began, but the room itself is almost unrecognizable from the one at the start of this story. The curtains are open. Sunlight actually reaches the bed. Evelyn's photograph stands upright on the nightstand, where a locked drawer used to be, Grace's photograph beside it, and beside that, a photograph of Laura, the three women who define, in the end, everything Charles actually built. There are no lawyers in the room, no folders marked will, just Laura, sitting close, holding his hand the way she once held a tray she never expected would change her life. "Do you regret it?" Charles asks her, his voice barely above breath now. "Walking in that night?" "I was only supposed to bring you dinner," Laura says, and there's a smile in it despite everything. Charles smiles back, the same soft, unguarded smile from the old photograph, the one Laura recognized before she understood why it mattered. "You brought me my whole life back," he says. He dies peacefully not long after, with his family's names finally spoken instead of hidden, his history finally told instead of buried, certain, for the first time in 58 years, that nothing about who he loved would end with him. Years later, Laura stands in the marble lobby of the very first Whitley hotel, the one where a waitress and a young man once fell in love in stairwells because there was nowhere else they were allowed to be seen together. A large photograph hangs where every guest entering the building will see it first, before the chandeliers, before the front desk, before anything else the Whitley name has ever tried to impress people with. Beneath it, a simple plaque, Evelyn Kizer. She was never invisible. Laura touches the locket at her throat, the same one that started all of it. The letters C+E, worn nearly smooth from being carried by 3 generations of women who never stopped believing they mattered, and walks into the boardroom, carrying both families' names forward, the way her grandmother always meant for someone. Eventually, too. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there's more where this came from. Drop a comment. Do you think Charles earned Laura's forgiveness, or did 58 years of silence cost him something no fortune could buy back? Like this video, if a family secret has ever changed the way you saw someone you thought you already knew.